Hi guys, and welcome to the session today on Ask the CISO. And with me today, I'm very fortunate to have Jonathan Nguyen, and he's from Fortinet, the Vice President of the Field CISO team. Jonathan, welcome and thank you so much for joining me today.
It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm glad to see you. I wish I were there in person. This is probably the first year in the last 10 years that I haven't been to Australia and New Zealand. So it's great to be here.
What percentage of clients are forecasted in your experience to move to an NBN/SD-WAN service in 2021, and how do they see this transformation is affecting their forecast growth?
Sure. So I think the adoption of SD-WAN is a larger reflection of this notion of all things software defined. And we're in the midst of a major transformation in both IT and networking, computing, and security. And the pandemic has just really accelerated a lot of these macro trends, right? And so what we're seeing is a transition from a hardware-defined perimeter to a software-defined perimeter. And that, in a nutshell, is where we've gone from that security world, where we were all sitting behind that hardware-defined perimeter, to a situation where in this pandemic, where 90+% of us are now working outside that perimeter. And that hardware-defined perimeter has now really been defined by software-defined elements. And it's a big transition because the center of the universe used to be that data center, the servers, right? Hub and spoke, router-based MPLS channels radiating outwards to users, right? And that sort of thing. That's that hardware perimeter. Now, when you take a look at it, the center of the universe really is the user and that endpoint. And that user is going to access network resources that are in that traditional enterprise private cloud, as well as instances and resources that are in the public cloud. And then they're going to be consuming services from the public cloud as well. And so what we have now is we've gone from a data center server-centric model of computing, networking, and security to one that's really centered upon the user. And that reflects the larger trend that every C-level, every team has been telling me for the last 6 to 9 months, which is that the object of the exercise is to deliver two things: the business outcome, the mission outcome, as well as the end user or customer experience. And so the larger picture is this transformation in how we conceive, utilize, and think about networking, security, and computing. And that's reflected in the software-defined trend. And so what's happening is that as we move away from that hardware-defined perimeter and that mainframe or that server, and we start using and consuming resources in the cloud, we have to think about access methodology. And so SD-WAN as a growth engine is primarily driven by the adoption of multi-cloud. And why is that? Because we need to ensure that users and entities, those IoT devices that are at remote locations and branch offices outside that enterprise perimeter, can have easy, seamless, and secure access to resources that are in public clouds. And so at the same time, that drives it. So I think the Gartner analysts and IDC and the others pretty much agree that right now we're at about a 40% adoption or in SD-WAN in the enterprise market space. And that roughly reflects to where we are in cloud adoption as well. There's been various degrees of cloud adoption, but over the next 3 to 5 years, what you'll see is about 90% of all the networking is going to be SD-WAN. And we're moving away. We'll still keep MPLS, but MPLS will be there for the critical functions and applications and workloads. But wherever possible, we're going to try to optimize the experience. We're going to optimize the security. We're going to optimize performance, and of course, the total cost of ownership. And so SD-WAN, with its inherent abilities of centralized management, zero-touch deployment, all done from remote locations, gives you that flexibility that the industry is going to be looking for. So fundamentally, there are a couple of things happening as we think about a shift towards software-defined things, right? And so SD-WAN is going to become the basis of that. But at the same time, Fortinet, since its beginnings, it's always said you shouldn't have to compromise between security and networking. You shouldn't have to compromise on security to get really great network performance, and you shouldn't have to compromise on network performance to get really great security. And more so than ever, the two are so integrated because of the goals of the business outcome and the end user experience are so equally paired that you can't think of them as separate elements. In fact, if you do, then one or the other tends to fail. And so in order to deliver that outcome, you really have the two converge. And that's what Fortinet has been saying since day one, which is that notion of converged networking and security called security-driven networking, right? And we've been doing that for years. And then up about what, a year ago now, Gartner comes out with SASE, Secure Access Service Edges, which is the very idea that as you move towards multi-cloud adoption and you have distributed computing, right? Then you have to more and more edges. And what we've seen is that you have to have security now on both, well, the endpoint edge, the LAN, if you will, the LAN edge, the wide area network edge, and the cloud edge. And in order to deliver on the promise of these software-defined form factors, the two have to be integrated. And so when I look across the landscape and the conversations I've had with CIOs and CISOs, what they're telling me is that, look, the pandemic has done a couple of things, but it's accelerated the ideas around contactless commerce. What we used to have as face-to-face engagements are now going to be replicated virtually. But in order to do that, and everything from financial services transactions to medical and health telehealth, when you have both clinical and non-clinical functions, you're going to have not only the movement of people and the delivery of services from the enterprise, but to remote environments, but you also have the requirements of enterprise-grade security and networking into those remote elements, right? When you think about that, you begin to see the challenge about how we used to approach security with a lot of vendors, a lot of devices, a hodgepodge of cloud-based instances, licensing models, consumption models, and management consoles, which we were all trying to integrate, and then somehow leverage really good threat research. So we have intel, and then try to automate so that we can respond in real time. It's a high level of complexity. And so the challenge about all these things is always the complexity of it. Because of the pandemic and because we're working outside our perimeter, now we have to think about what is the security model moving forward. And it's about zero trust. And zero trust, like we all know, but it's a refresher for folks in the audience. Zero trust was first posited back in the ancient days around 2009, right? And think about that. We've gone so far in 10 years. In 2009, one of the analysts companies came out with this notion called zero trust. Back then they were called what? They weren't called internal segmented firewalls. They were called something else, right? But the idea that you could put an appliance at that stage and that you could ensure that traffic sitting behind that hardware-defined perimeter was trusted no more than traffic outside that hardware-defined wall, moat, and keep. And so the idea was that you should not trust purely on location, and that you're going to try to implement what the intelligence community called a need-to-know basis, right? It's sort of like the way my wife treats me with our household affairs. That's Jonathan's on a need-to-know basis, and so how do we apply least privileged need-to-know basis for every request for network access? And so zero trust became very lively and it was a buzzword about 4 or 5 years ago because of the large data breaches we saw around the world, but importantly here in the United States. And thereafter, zero trust gained a lot of traction because of the pandemic, because the hardware-defined perimeter is increasingly less relevant when 90% of your staff are working from remote locations, right? And so there are 5 elements in zero trust, and I would add one more. The first is that you're going to need to identify and authenticate the person or entity, the device that's requesting the access. You're also going to have to inspect the device or platform on which that request for network access is being made. And then you're going to have to validate that that request, say by Jonathan Nguyen for access to the mail server, is legitimate, right? And then once you grant him access to that resource, that application, that workload, you have to log and monitor everything to make sure that over time, because trust is not a one-time incident, but it's an iterative and continual assessment. God, I sound like a certain analyst community when I say things like that. And then I would add humbly that you should also determine the final disposition of what Jonathan accessed. So when he pulled that document, that spreadsheet, that PowerPoint, whatever, from the cloud and download it onto his endpoint. What did he do to it? Did he change it from a CIA perspective, confidentiality, integrity, and availability? And then what did he do with it? Did he send it back into that cloud, then send it to another cloud? Did he keep it on his device? Did he offload it from his device to attach storage media, for instance, right? So I think it's really important to add that. And you've got all types of different things. And so I think I like about Fortinet's approach is that we offer flexibility in form factors. I love the CASB. It's underappreciated because it's really the CASB capability, the cloud access security brokerage, that gives you visibility into what was the final disposition of what was accessed, right? What did Jonathan really do? So that's a critical element in the zero trust solution. And then on the network side, it's the SD-WAN components and all things around that, and the ability to deliver that in multiple form factors, licensing models, right? And consumption models. Here's an approach that says, hey, if you're using the FortiGate as a foundation of the solution, we're gonna do the integration, and that this stack of technology is gonna work together, and then we're gonna consolidate it onto one form factor. I said, wow, that makes it interesting. And by the way, there's SD-WAN on it as well. So I don't have to get another element there. And then we're going to have an open partner program that has 400 plus partners that brings integration via APIs and connectors that both we write in some cases, in other cases they write, so that the Fortinet security fabric that's already broad and it's integrated and it's automated, now it's integrated with 400 different companies representing about 3,000 different devices. And so I said, holy cow, wait a minute. As an operator, you're going to take that burden off my shoulders and allow me to focus on actually doing my job and operating the technology? That's huge.
Back to one of the big components as well, from focusing on the business outcomes and how security can be a business enabler. You touching exactly on that.
The hardest thing about being a service provider is the ability to do things at economies of scale. The challenge is, how do you have a differentiated offering that is attractive to the marketplace, but it's not so standardized that it's irrelevant? But you need standardization because you have to keep costs low, right? It's a, how do you, because I know the burden, and every service provider in the audience is probably nodding their head right now because it's the fourth quarter and we're all where we were writing our business cases, right? And so you're always thinking of ways to automate, to standardize, to reduce costs, but add value at the same time. And, the telcos that I've spoken to said, look, with the adoption rate moving from 40 to 90%, you're not going to slow down the erosion of MPLS revenue. I've been there. I still have scars on my back about the efforts to try to change that, and you can't change that. That's the nature of the evolution of the technology and the usage model. But where you can is to offset that, to grow the revenue on SD-WAN. On security and on 5G, and so right now for the carrier space is they're really looking at how do we provide the SD-WAN capability in a form factor that allows things like virtual or universal premises-based equipment, right? The idea that you have one device, one platform, that you can put a multitude of features and functionalities that you can manage remotely, so it's low touch, right? But that it's integrated. And how do you deliver the networking component and the security component across that? If you are a telco or a cloud provider, I think there are a couple of lessons that I've seen, both having sat on that side of the table as well as speaking with the folks who do that today, is that you need to offer those capability and as most organic or channel friendly way as possible. What you want to avoid at all costs is having to go into partnership with companies which essentially don't add any value, which means that you're skimming off a low margin on a resell, white labeling. In many cases, not even a white labeling. And in many cases, the customers will ask you, well, why the heck am I going through you to get to A and Z company, for instance, right? Makes no sense. And so one of the great things about Fortinet is that we now have that ability to work with carriers and telcos in multiple ways, right? Whether they want to do a straight resell, depending on their size, and whether they're a small value-added partner, or whether they're a small telco or a niche boutique type company, or a large international global carrier grade company. wherever it makes sense. Is it a resell of that capability? Is it helping them build out a more CapEx-based capability where they're organically owning? Because the real magic, I mean, the real value as a service provider isn't necessarily those services. The real value is the customer support, right? It's what the service provider brings to the table that no one else can is that intimate relationship with that customer, the understanding of their business model, right? What we bring to the table is that technology and the infrastructure that that service provider doesn't have to bear or wants to bear over time. It just depends on what they want to do. But increasingly, what I'm seeing are telcos that say we're going to offer SD-WAN. We're going to try to consolidate our platforms, and then along the way, they're all investing billions of dollars, U.S., Canadian, Australian, Hong Kong, you name it, dollars, and some euros and other currencies, but billions of dollars worth of investments in 5G. To support things like augmented reality, industrial applications. And so for telcos, if that's the next turn, right? If the immediate 3 to 5 years looks like SASE and SD-WAN, and then we'll talk after this about the changes in managed security services. And the next iteration of growth in computing and networking is edge-based computing, right? So as we go further into digital transformation and more elements of our infrastructure, the roads, the factories, the agriculture, the buildings themselves become sensor-based, right? Because in order to get data-driven decision-making, you've got to have data. The data is the telemetry that's gathered by sensors, and you have accelerated manufacturing, you have predictive and proactive maintenance and contracting. You're beginning to see how all of these things become integrated and then optimized for outcomes. And in order to do that, computing is going to be as close to that user, as close to that edge as possible. And so then the telcos and the service providers are beginning to think about, how do we do that? How do we secure not only the SD-WAN and the SASE components of those traditional computing models? And by the way, here the research suggests that today, some 85% of all the computing and data generated are those traditional workloads and applications that we're familiar with, the productivity suites, the CRM, the Salesforce.com, ServiceNow, all the things that we have in our private clouds or we consume from public clouds. But 3, 5, 10 years from now, 85 to 90% of all the computing and data generated will be done on the edge. Well, that's where it's going to be done. And about 25% of that's going to be sent back to the cloud. Because even today, as we think about autonomous vehicles, right, and level 5 autonomous vehicles, they're still based on sending information back to the cloud. The awareness of those systems, if you will, are based upon telemetry. As we move forward and we accelerate things, those devices, those platforms, these automated vehicles will be networked together. So they're aware of each other because they're connected, they're networked with each other. So they can determine what is the optimum speed between 65 kilometers per hour. See, I'm speaking to an Aussie, right? And so I'm in metric, okay? So you have to give me,
for that for moving.
gotta give me points as an American that I'm speaking in metric, right? So what is the optimal distance? How many meters should the vehicles be apart so that they can travel at 65 kilometers per hour or 120 kilometers per hour, right? So if you're making that 5-hour drive or so from Sydney to Canberra, I've done it, you know, how should those vehicles be spaced? And that's going to be a situation where vehicles are networked together. And that's what I see when I think about what's happening around the pipe. And that's why those large telcos and carriers are investing in 5G to deliver not only the enriched gaming experience, right? But the augmented reality, the ability to do robotics, the ability to do remote medicine, like surgery, for instance, training, education, all of those contactless commerce, telehealth services, public services, all the predictive and proactive capabilities, all of that's going to be dependent upon really high speed, like 100 times faster than 4G. So you have high speed, high fidelity, highly reliable networks at the edge that can transmit elephant-sized loads of information, not just movies, right, but huge volumes of information. So, and all that has to be secured as well.
And how do you see the change from what you're talking about there now when we're talking about more from the OT environment and how those things will be connected? Specifically what you mentioned about the consolidation, the investment in 5G and the edges that's forming. How do you see the integration is going to be with both the OT environment, but also what do you see is going to be the impact from from a revenue perspective? What is it that the telcos are going to be looking at to say, how can we, like, what is the business model for them to give the user experience? And also, what are some of the security risks that you see from, hey, hold on, we have to consider these 2 or 3 points as well going into this?
Yeah, so the telco revenue is going to be all of that data that's going to be generated and transmitted, right? So if it's 5G, it's going to be wireless. And because these devices are networked with each other. I mean, just the amount of data that's generated on an aircraft today, right? Think about the amount of data that's generated between those interconnected vehicles, the amount of data that's generated by robots, right? The amount of data in any industrial application, in addition to the augmented reality. And so, yeah, those big telcos are not investing in 5G because they want a gaming experience. I know my children are terribly disappointed in that, but the reality is that the big bet is for industrial applications. And so we're seeing that today. And we're seeing security teams that are grappling with the convergence of OT and IT environments, right? And they're two fundamentally different things. The IT environment is about performance, it's about the user experience, it's about delivering that outcome, right? And the OT environment, life and limb issues, industrial applications, it's all about availability. It has to be running, it has to be available. And when you're dealing in the telco environment, you're dealing with the difference between 3 nines and anything above 3 nines, right? When you go above that, you go to 5 nines, 4 nines, it's triple the cost for every additional 9. And while 3 nines or 99.95 is perfectly adequate for IT environments, it's not going to be adequate for the OT environment. So know that drives costs way up. And then when you're thinking about the convergence of OT and IT, and that's happening every day, is how do you maintain awareness and security on those systems that are very different than your IT environment? And you know, we talk about software-defined and hardware-defined perimeters. When we talk about an OT environment, they're typically air-gapped. They need to be separated, right? And that's increasingly difficult. And in so many cases, I see environments that are hypothetically, and based upon the security team. So that's an interesting point to pause there. Security teams work on the idea of what should be there. Threat actors work on the idea of what is actually there, right? And in many cases, because of that lack of visibility, because of the lack of integration, a lot of IT teams and security teams aren't really aware of what's operating, even inside those air-gapped environments. And so I think what is happening, what we're doing with regards to using our 40AI capabilities to really inspect and enhance the accuracy and automation of security in those environments is very telling. So, but for example, earlier this year, we rolled out our 40 AI virtual security analysts, which in its current form factor is a self-contained appliance that is a artificial neural network that is designed, that is self-learning, designed for air-gapped environments. So it's self-contained. The whole idea is that it is soaking in and it's tuning continuously in that environment to understand what normal looks like, right? And the most interesting thing about that 40 AI virtual security analyst is that in the test that we ran, it was able to demonstrate that it is the equivalent of 5 average human analysts, right? So the great thing about machines, good and bad, is that they're neither good, bad, nor indifferent. The good thing about a self-learning platform is that it's always improving. And so not only is it the equivalent of 5 average human analysts, but then in week 10, it was be able to demonstrably show that its performance was better than the average human analyst. So not only are you getting the cost savings, you're getting enhanced and better visibility. So AI is really the way I look about how you're going to manage the complexity of an OT environment, so that you can look at the layer 2 traffic and understand that's a conveyor belt, that's a thermostat, that is something else, right? Our ability to do that is going to be key. And so when you look at that type of environment, how do you manage that level of complexity? How do you manage that level of threat environment? And so for telcos and for carriers and service providers right now, you know, I think we're at a crossroads in managed security services, because event monitoring is pretty much commoditized, and so is device management. And that's reflected in what's happening in the industry. So you have the rise of managed detection and response companies, the MDR companies. You have the rise of SOC as a service. You have the rise of SIEM as a service. You have the rise of incident response as a service. You have the rise of so many different things in managed security service. So if you're to the left of the detonation, left of the boom of malware, it's all about monitoring and assessments. And if to the right of the detonation, then it's all about detection and response. And so I think the trends facing service providers out there is, look, most enterprises today, the larger enterprises, are going to focus on one or the other. No one does it alone now. So security is definitely not a DIY exercise, and it never should have been to begin with, right? So I think in the enterprise space, the focus ought to be on the managed detection and response capabilities, on incident response capabilities, the higher end services, the above tier 3 level services. Those are things that very few organizations have capabilities in. That's where the value add is. And by the way, for telcos, that's really the ability to leverage your experience and apply them. You know, in the mid-market and the SMB space, that's where I see your traditional MSS type services. They've got a very small team. They're not going to run a SOC. They're not going to run a SIEM. What they're really looking for is a managed service that delivers compliance and a reasonable level of care. And that's where I see your standard types of services around security monitoring, some level of incident response, MDR and EDR, right? And by the way, EDR is more important than ever. Why? Because the trend towards remote working. And so when you look at remote working, and by the way, that's not going to change. In fact, the practical reality is work is being redefined from a place we used to go to and commute from to something we do, right? And so the estimate here is in the United States that some 40% of all adults will permanently remote work as part of their normal schedule moving forward. So whether that's full-time or part-time remote working, some 90 million of us. And we're never going to get those home networks to be secure. So the importance of endpoint protection, the EDR capability comes into play as well. So my advice to service providers and telcos are you going to focus in on the remote workers and have the standard types of managed security services, your traditional MSS, event monitoring, with some additional advanced features on detection, and really detection in the point of on the endpoint, right? In the enterprise space, certainly you can offer security event monitoring. It could be commoditized, and that team for the larger enterprise may do the incident response, which is probably more than their bailiwick. I tend to think, as my friend Christina Richmond from IDC said, look, device management is most likely going to flow towards the larger platform services companies, those types of people who do things like that. Device management is pretty mundane, pretty commoditized, right? And then focus on the high-end services in the enterprise space. By the way, I don't think anyone's going to be able to be successful in selling SD-WAN unless they have that integrated approach. If you've got a situation where you're cobbling together one vendor for the SD-WAN component, another vendor for the security stack, another vendor to handle the cloud security element, by the time you get it all done, you really haven't consolidated much, right? And so I was reminding someone the other day who said that the perimeter and hardware is going to die soon. I said, no. Private data clouds aren't going away, right? Private data lakes aren't going away. And there's always going to be an endpoint because we have to use something. And so there's going to be hardware involved. And so wherever those edges appear on the endpoint, that LAN, the wide area network, in the cloud, you're going to have security. And I think that for a long time, as a philosophical point, is that when you speak to carriers and operators, and you ask them, well, why do you have box sprawl? Why do you have so many vendors? And why do you swallow the amount of complexity and shoulder the burden of managing all that technology? They say, because I don't want to have a single failure cascade across the entire stack. And that's true, and that's valid. But that's basically a low probability but high impact incident. But when you do that by by allowing the other things, what you end up doing is you allow the low probability, low impact things to happen. And those little, death by 1,000 pinpricks, right, they lead to some systemic issues. And I know these are systemic issues because the research says here are 3 statistics which haven't changed in the last decade in cybersecurity. The first is that some 17 to 20% of the issues that lead to disruptions and data breaches were caused by simple human error, right? The second one is that you've got situations where 77% of all the data breaches, think almost 80%, almost 8 out of 10 disruptions and data breaches were not discovered by the internal security team. They were discovered by victims, by researchers, and law enforcement. And so pause it for a second there. We're spending about 250 billion US this year on network security. I have no idea what your exchange rate is right now, but $250 billion in security, and we're still not detecting the data breach. What does that tell you? Is that when you have that much box sprawl, that much level of complexity, you're still managing complexity and you're missing out on the little things that tell you, by the way, you've got a disruption or a breach that's in occurrence. And finally, the statistic that's really quite telling and even equally disturbing is that 99% of all the vulnerabilities that were exploited were known for at least a year, right? So think about that for a moment. We spent $250 billion in cybersecurity, and in perfect case where we know exactly what to look for, right? Here's a piece of software. Here's something that needs to be patched, needs to be updated. Here's the patch, right? Here's the fix. Go do it. It doesn't get done in 99% of the cases, right? So that tells you that the level of complexity, because I don't think we're slovenly, lazy people, or that we don't spend enough and we don't care, right? Even though some people will say that because we say no to a lot of things. But security people try very hard to manage that level of complexity. And the challenges were overwhelmed by the complexity that we built. I would say, look, really take a look at the benefits of having a large, complex environment, because the data to this point suggests that that's simply not working, right? And there was a journalist who asked me recently, Jonathan, why do traditional security approaches fail? And they said they fail because they're not broad, they're not integrated, and they're not automated, because they leave gaps. And wherever these gaps appear, it's where bad things happen. And we know that, right? And so I think that the way you succeed in this marketplace as a carrier, as a service provider, is that you've got to offer things that are integrated out of the box. And the integration, I think, today is around networking and security, and it has to be across all those edges that we spoke to. And I think the going forward strategy is around zero trust. I remember a conversation, one of those conversations, what Aussies would call a bottle day, right? And it was a conversation I had with a fellow who's one of the leading advanced threat actors for the US government. He's our APT, right? He's the guy. And I said, so how do I defend against people like you? And he said, look, we hunt networks and then we hunt people. We hunt sysadmins, right? We hunt for the networks because we want to know that's a network that we need to penetrate. And within that network, there are systems that we need to compromise, and through those systems, get access to the data. Well, the people who have the keys to those systems are sysadmins, right? So he said, what's your sysadmins? And essentially zero trust is focused around, first, applying zero trust to your critical assets and your users. Monitor the heck out of them, right? Because typically that's what happens. And then beyond that, moving concentric circles outwards. And I think the solutions we have in play are the right way forward. The service provider community gets it. I've seen a lot of traction in zero trust. So it's an exciting time, but we're gonna see SD-WAN become the foundation. It's really the connective tissue, right? And I believe it was Gartner that said that SASE and by implication SD-WAN will be foundational to enterprise networking, going forward. So there's a glimpse into the future. And so if you're a service provider, you've got to have those capabilities, right? If you are a consumer of services, and right now you're pausing to think about how you're going to spend your 2021 dollars, then think about consolidation. How do I reduce box sprawl, reduce the level of complexity in my environment, enhance the accuracy of what I'm seeing and my ability to provide services? And how do I manage both the networking piece, the security piece, and do it in a way that not only enhances performance, but lowers cost. And you know, if I were still wearing that operator's hat, and I absolutely would take a look at that Fortinet security fabric and really begin taking a look at that ability to do converged networking and security. That's just such a no-brainer, right? And then, you know, I'm getting better security, I'm getting lower costs, I'm freeing my people from the burden of doing integration, I'm enhancing their ability to do their jobs. That's a no-brainer. So that's what I'm seeing today in the carrier space and the enterprise space.
I think I can't remember the last time I made so many notes in one of these Ask the CISO series. For me, a couple of things that I really enjoy is how you again talked about the business outcomes. I think for a CISO type of thing, that's one of the things that I see here in Australia is focus on the business first. And to consolidate what you just said as well is understand where is your assets, understand how you protect those assets. And one of the ways to do that is bring that back into zero trust. And I really love that you talk about that. How you talk about that from moving into the 4 pillars that we really believe is going to be a key component for helping businesses. And that is that zero trust is bringing that SD-WAN and SASE capabilities. I really like how you talk about how that's going to be a core pillar as well for businesses to look at and bring that into the cloud strategies with the implications we see there, how we can bring in automation in there, and also bring that into the AI and automation.
The great benefit for CISOs, and I speak with is that their issue is not a technology issue. Their biggest challenge are the business issues, right, and dealing with their boards. And what I found is that if you can help a CISO and his or her team speak about security in a monetized way, meaning that, look, this is what security enables on any given day for this enterprise. You can monetize it in terms of public trust for government agencies as well, is that this is what it delivers. And the spend on this approach delivers the following ways of reducing that exposure, right? So then at the end, you have what's called residual risk. This is the amount of risk in monetized definition after we've done all of these things. And then everyone can make a decision about, yeah, we're willing to absorb that risk and accept it. We're going to try to mitigate that maybe by insurance, or that we're going to spend on additional capabilities to try to reduce that to a point where we can tolerate that, right? And so once you get into the monetization of risk, and on top of that, you're saying, by the way, not only can I protect this current productivity level, but I can enhance it, right, by expanding services and the transformation of those branch offices again. And then I can reduce the cost as well. I'm returning. That's the ROI that lots of security teams are trying to run down and get their arms around, right? But off the bat, if I were an operator today and I could return an additional 30% to my bottom line, you know, that's a win-win. And by the way, amongst my CISO friends, when they take a job, one of the first deliverables they have in that first year is to generate a cost savings somewhere around the 25 to 30% load, right? So that's reasonable. You can do that. The hard part is sustaining that, right?
It's really amazing spending this time with you. Thank you so much for joining an Ask the CISO session today. What is the best way people can get hold of you?
For me, it's LinkedIn, right? So to all my friends in Australia, you know who you are. I still owe many a pint, and so I will find my way down there at some point in the future. You're going on your spring right now. I hope it's a better year than last, right? I hope there's more rainfall. I hope the fires go away. But yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn. Just look up Jonathan Nguyen. You'll find me there on LinkedIn. Or when you publish this, just my name will be on there, I hope, and then you can always find me there.